When a music hall performer receives mysterious stick figure drawings, no one expects it will lead to murder. Welcome to Café Stories. I am your host, Alfie. Today we're stepping into the foggy streets of Victorian London with Sherlock Holmes in The Dancing Death. I truly treasure this community we've built together, so drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from today. Now settle in with your favorite drink as we begin this classic Doyle-style mystery of revenge served cold. Sherlock Holmes and the Dancing Death. Chapter 1. The Figures in Ink. It was in the latter part of October in the year 1887 that the singular case which I have termed the Dancing Death came to the attention of my friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. The weather had turned decidedly chill, and a persistent London fog had settled over the city for the better part of a week, casting a grey pallor over the streets and reducing foot traffic to a minimum. I had called upon Holmes at our old quarters in Baker Street and found him seated in his armchair before the fire, his long, thin fingers steepled beneath his chin in that characteristic pose of deep contemplation. 3 or 4 sheets of paper lay upon the small table beside him, covered with chemical formulae and calculations in his precise handwriting. "Ah, Watson," he said, without turning his gaze from the dancing flames, "I perceive that your practice has been quiet today. The damp weather has been aggravating your old wound, I see." I had long since ceased to be surprised at my friend's seemingly preternatural observations. "Yes, indeed," I replied, settling into the chair opposite him. "But how could you possibly know about my practice?" Holmes gave a slight smile. "Had you been busy, you would have arrived later, and your bag would show signs of recent use. As for your wound, you favoured your left leg slightly as you entered, something you do only when the barometer falls below a certain point." I chuckled and reached for the evening paper. "Some things never change, my dear fellow." "On the contrary, Watson," Holmes remarked with sudden animation, "change is the one constant we can rely upon, and it is often in the subtle alterations of routine that we find the most intriguing mysteries." No sooner had he spoken these words than Mrs. Hudson knocked and entered, announcing a visitor. "A Mr. Percy Holloway to see you, Mr. Holmes. He seems most distressed." Holmes straightened in his chair. "Show him in at once, Mrs. Hudson." The man who entered our sitting-room was of medium height but extraordinary physique. Though perhaps 40 years of age, he possessed a remarkable flexibility in his movements that was immediately apparent even in the simple act of removing his hat and coat. His face, though handsome, bore the signs of someone who had not slept properly for several days, with dark circles beneath his eyes and a nervous tremor in his hands. "Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice surprisingly deep for his frame, "I am Percy Holloway. You may have heard of me as the Elastic Man at the Criterion." "Indeed," Holmes replied, gesturing to a chair. "Your reputation precedes you. Your ability to contort yourself into seemingly impossible positions while maintaining a comedic narrative has earned you considerable acclaim." Holloway seemed momentarily gratified by this recognition before his expression clouded once more. "It is precisely because of my prominence that I find myself in a most disturbing situation, sir." "Pray sit down and tell us your troubles," Holmes said, reaching for his pipe. Our visitor sank into the offered chair and withdrew from his breast pocket a small bundle of papers which he handed to Holmes with evident reluctance. "These began arriving 3 weeks ago," he explained. "At first I thought them merely the work of a disturbed admirer or perhaps a jealous rival, but their persistence and the increasing specificity of their illustrations has convinced me that something more sinister is afoot." Holmes carefully spread the papers upon his knee. I leaned forward to catch a glimpse and saw what appeared to be crude drawings of stick figures in various poses of dance or movement. "Most curious," murmured Holmes, examining each sheet with his pocket lens. "These are not random figures, Mr. Holloway. They display a deliberate pattern, a sequence of sorts." "You see it too?" Holloway asked eagerly. I felt there was something methodical about them, though I cannot decipher their meaning. Holmes held one sheet up to the light. "Quality paper, commercially available but expensive. The ink is common enough. The hand that drew these figures is educated but attempting to disguise its natural style. Note the pressure points where the pen has lingered, indicative of someone considering their next stroke carefully, not the spontaneous scrawling of a madman." "Can you make anything of them, Holmes?" I inquired. "Not without further data, Watson," he replied, setting the papers aside. "Mr. Holloway, have you any enemies of whom you are aware? Anyone who might bear you ill will?" The performer shook his head. "None that I can think of, Mr. Holmes. My act is comedic, not satirical. I mock no one but myself." "And your private affairs? Any entanglements that might provoke resentment?" "I live a modest life outside the theatre, sir. I am unmarried, keep to myself, and have few close acquaintances in the profession." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "Tell me, have you brought all the messages you've received?" "All save one, which arrived this morning at the theatre," Holloway replied, reaching once more into his pocket. This was different from the others. The paper he handed to Holmes contained the same stick figure style, but this time the figure appeared to be lying horizontal rather than dancing. A chill ran down my spine as I noted the crude smile drawn across its face. Holmes studied it intently. "Mr. Holloway, you perform this evening at the Criterion, do you not?" "Yes, at 8 o'clock. "Then Watson and I shall attend. Say nothing of our coming. Continue as you normally would, but be vigilant. Observe your surroundings with particular attention to anyone who seems out of place or overly interested in your movements." "You believe I am in danger?" Holloway asked, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I believe, Mr. Holloway, that someone is going to extraordinary lengths to communicate with you in a coded fashion," Holmes replied carefully. "Whether that poses immediate danger I cannot yet say, but I shall know more after witnessing your performance and the environment in which you work." The performer rose, visibly relieved to have shared his burden. "Thank you, Mr. Holmes. I feel better knowing you will be there." After our visitor had departed, Holmes sat in silence for several minutes, his eyes half closed, the forgotten pipe still clutched in his hand. "What do you make of it, Holmes?" I ventured at last. Holmes's eyes snapped open. "I have formed several theories, Watson, but it would be premature to voice them. One thing, however, is certain. Those crude dancing figures contain a message, and I believe it is one of significant importance to our client, and potentially of grave consequence." Chapter 2. Death Takes the Stage. The Criterion Theatre was unusually crowded that evening, a fact which Holmes noted with interest as we made our way to our seats in the third row of the stalls. The foggy weather had not deterred London's entertainment seekers, and a palpable air of anticipation filled the ornate auditorium. "Observe the audience carefully, Watson," Holmes murmured as we settled in. "If our theory is correct, the sender of those curious messages may well be among them tonight." "What precisely am I looking for?" I inquired, casting my gaze across the sea of faces dimly illuminated by the gaslights. Any person showing undue interest in Holloway rather than his performance. Anyone who appears to be watching for reaction rather than entertainment. The house lights dimmed, and the orchestra struck up a lively tune. The first several acts passed without incident. A soprano of moderate talent, a juggler whose skills were remarkable, and a trained dog act that delighted the younger members of the audience. Finally, the master of ceremonies announced the Elastic Man, the incomparable Percy Holloway, to enthusiastic applause. Holloway bounded onto the stage with astonishing energy. Despite the concerns that had brought him to Baker Street earlier that day, his performance betrayed no sign of distress. His routine consisted of a series of increasingly improbable contortions interspersed with witty commentary, each feat more remarkable than the last. At one point he appeared to dislocate his shoulder to slide through the frame of a chair, only to pop it back in place with a comedic flourish and grimace that set the audience roaring with laughter. "Extraordinary physical control," Holmes commented quietly. "Note the precision of his movements, Watson. This is no mere circus contortionist, but an artist who has spent years perfecting his discipline." Throughout the performance, Holmes's keen eyes scanned the audience rather than the stage. Several times I observed him focus intently on one spectator or another, only to move on after a moment's scrutiny. I attempted to follow his gaze, but could discern nothing unusual about the theatre-goers he observed. As Holloway took his final bow to thunderous applause, Holmes leaned close to me. "I have identified 3 individuals of interest," he said. "A gentleman in the upper circle with opera glasses who has not once trained them on the stage, a stagehand visible in the wings who appears to have no function there, and a woman in a box who has been sketching throughout the performance." "Any of them could be our mysterious artist," I suggested. "Perhaps, but it would be premature to confront them without further evidence," Holmes replied. "Let us send our card to Holloway backstage and gain his impressions of the evening." We made our way through the crowded foyer to the stage door, where a harried-looking attendant took Holmes's card with a promise to deliver it promptly. We waited in a narrow corridor lined with peeling theatrical posters from seasons past. "Mr. Holmes?" Holloway appeared, still in his stage makeup, but with a dressing gown thrown over his performance attire. "I am so glad you came. Did you observe anything unusual?" "Several possibilities that require further investigation," Holmes answered. "Did you notice anything out of the ordinary during your performance?" Holloway shook his head. "When I am on stage, Mr. Holmes, I am entirely focused on my routine. It demands complete concentration, but I felt safer knowing you were in the audience." Holmes nodded. "You have a performance tomorrow evening as well, I believe?" "Yes, the final one of this run. After that, I begin preparations for my new routine at the Alhambra next month." "Excellent. We shall attend tomorrow night as well. In the meantime, exercise caution, particularly when leaving the theatre tonight. Watson and I shall wait and accompany you to a cab." Holloway thanked us and returned to his dressing room to change. Holmes and I stepped outside to the alley behind the theatre where the stage door opened, a thin mist swirling around the dim gas lamps. "Do you believe he is in immediate danger?" I asked. Holmes pulled his coat tighter against the damp chill. "The pattern of the messages suggests a methodical mind, Watson, one building towards something specific. Whether that culmination is violence or merely a dramatic revelation, I cannot yet determine." We waited in silence for several minutes until the stage door burst open, and a young stagehand emerged, his face ashen in the lamplight. "Help! A doctor! Is there a doctor here?" he cried. I stepped forward immediately. "I am a physician. What has happened?" "It's Mr. Holloway, sir. He's been—" The boy choked on the words. "Please come quickly." Holmes and I rushed through the stage door, following the stagehand down a maze of narrow corridors to Holloway's dressing room. 2 other theatre employees stood outside, their expressions grim. One was vomiting into a handkerchief. "Stand aside," Holmes commanded, pushing open the door. The sight that greeted us was grotesque. Percy Holloway, lay sprawled across the floor, his limbs arranged in an unnatural position reminiscent of his stage contortions. But it was his face that arrested the attention, painted with grease paint into a ghastly, exaggerated smile that stretched from ear to ear. His eyes stared sightlessly at the ceiling, and a thin trickle of blood had run from the corner of his mouth onto the worn carpet. Holmes knelt swiftly beside the body, his keen eyes taking in every detail. I joined him, checking for pulse or breath, though it was evident that Holloway was beyond medical aid. "How long has he been like this?" Holmes asked the stagehand. "Can't have been more than 10 minutes, sir. He sent me to fetch a bottle of wine to celebrate the performance. When I came back—" The young man gestured helplessly at the scene. Holmes carefully examined the room, moving methodically from the door to the dressing table, lifting objects and peering underneath furniture. Finally, he straightened and pointed to a small piece of paper that had been pinned to the dead man's costume, which lay draped over a chair. "Another dancing figure, Watson," he said grimly. "But this one is different from those he showed us earlier." I looked at the crude drawing and felt a chill run down my spine. The stick figure was contorted into an impossible position, much like the poor victim on the floor before us. Holmes turned to the stagehand. "Fetch Inspector Lestrade from Scotland Yard at once. Tell him there has been a murder at the Criterion and that Sherlock Holmes requests his presence immediately." As the boy hurried away, Holmes continued his examination in silence. I knew better than to interrupt when he was in such a focused state. Finally, he stood in the center of the room, his eyes narrowed. "We are dealing with someone of considerable calculation, Watson," he said quietly. "This was not a crime of passion or opportunity. Every element has been staged for maximum theatrical effect." Outside, we could hear the commotion as news of the tragedies spread through the theatre. The case of the dancing figures had taken a deadly turn, and I could not help but wonder what dark performance was yet to come. Chapter 3. The Second Act. It was nearly noon the following day before Inspector Lestrade had completed his initial investigation at the Criterion Theatre. The newspapers had already seized upon the sensational nature of Holloway's death, their headlines proclaiming the theatrical murder and death of the Elastic Man. Holmes had spent the morning in deep concentration, analysing the dancing figure drawings at our Baker Street lodgings while I reviewed my notes on the case. "This latest figure differs from the others in several key respects," Holmes remarked, holding the paper recovered from Holloway's dressing room to the light. "The line quality is identical, the same hand drew them all, but this one was clearly prepared after the decision to murder had been made. Note the precision of the distorted posture, Watson. Our killer knew exactly how the body would be positioned." "A chilling premeditation," I observed. "Indeed. And yet there is something almost ritualistic about the arrangement. This is not merely murder, but performance." A sharp knock at our door heralded the arrival of Inspector Lestrade, looking haggard after his night of investigation. "Well, Mr. Holmes, this is a pretty business," he said, removing his bowler hat and settling into the chair Holmes offered. "The theatre folk are in an uproar, and the press are hounding us for developments." "Have you established the cause of death?" Holmes inquired. "The police surgeon believes poison, though we await confirmation." There was a glass of brandy, half consumed, on the dressing table. "And the theatrical makeup used on the victim's face?" Lestrade frowned. "Standard grease paint, according to the theatre manager, though none of the other performers recognized the particular shade of red used for the smile. Most peculiar." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "What of Holloway's effects? Did you find anything of note?" "Nothing unusual save these," Lestrade replied, producing a small envelope from his pocket. an unusual pair of cufflinks found in his waistcoat, quite distinctive. Holmes took the envelope and tipped the contents into his palm. The cufflinks were crafted of silver, each bearing the design of a jester's cap in intricate detail. "Most interesting," Holmes murmured, examining them with his pocket lens. "Fine workmanship, at least 15 years old, judging by the wear patterns, and custom-made rather than mass-produced." Our conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Hudson, who entered with a telegram for Holmes. He read it quickly, his expression sharpening with interest. "Gentlemen," he announced, "we have a second act in this grim drama. Gilbert Thornton, a ventriloquist performing at the Bedford Music Hall, has been found dead in circumstances remarkably similar to Holloway's murder." Lestrade jumped to his feet. "Another one? When?" "This morning. The body was discovered by a cleaning woman." Holmes was already reaching for his coat. "We must proceed there at once." A hansom conveyed us swiftly to the Bedford Music Hall, where a constable stood guard at the stage door. The manager, a portly man with the florid complexion of one who enjoys his own establishment's offerings, led us through the backstage area to his small dressing room. "Terrible business, gentlemen, terrible," he muttered. Mr. Thornton was to be our headline act for the next fortnight. A consummate professional, never any trouble. The scene within the dressing room bore a ghastly similarity to what we had witnessed at the Criterion. Gilbert Thornton sat propped in a chair, his ventriloquist's dummy arranged on his lap as though in mid-performance. The dead man's face bore the same painted rictus smile as Holloway's, the red grease paint standing in stark contrast to the pallor of death. Holmes circled the room slowly, his keen eyes missing nothing. He examined the window, locked from the inside, the drinking glass on the side table, empty save for a residue, and the victim's clothing. "Look here, Watson," he said quietly, indicating the dead man's wrists. "The cufflinks." I bent closer and saw, to my astonishment, a pair of silver cufflinks identical to those found on Holloway, each bearing the design of a jester's cap. "This cannot be a coincidence," I said. "Coincidence is a lazy explanation favoured by those who fear the implications of connection," Holmes replied. He turned to Lestrade. "Inspector, I believe we are dealing with a killer who is selecting his victims with great deliberation. These men are being chosen for specific reasons." "But what reasons, Mr. Holmes?" Lestrade asked. "A contortionist and a ventriloquist. What connects them?" Holmes did not answer immediately, but continued his examination of the room. After several minutes, he straightened up, holding a small piece of paper that had been tucked beneath the dummy's wooden hand. "Another dancing figure," he said, showing us the now familiar stick drawing. "This one positioned as though manipulating a puppet. Our killer is leaving us a narrative, gentlemen, if we can but read it." "I shall need a complete list of every performer scheduled to appear at London's music halls in the coming week," Holmes informed Lestrade. "We must identify potential victims before the killer strikes again." Back at Baker Street that afternoon, Holmes immersed himself in research, consulting various theatrical directories and newspaper clippings. I assisted by organizing what information we had gathered on both victims. "There must be a connection beyond their profession," Holmes mused, pacing before the fireplace. "Something specific that links them and potentially others who may be in danger." "Could they have known each other?" I suggested. "More than known each other, I suspect," Holmes replied. "Ah, here we have something." He held up a yellowed theatrical program. "Henley's Travelling Wonders, a touring company that performed throughout rural England some 15 years ago. Both Holloway and Thornton are listed among the company." Holmes spread several programs across the table, each showing the same troupe, but from different village performances. "We must compile a complete roster of this company, Watson, and determine who among them still lives. I believe our killer is working through a very specific list." While I began this task, Holmes examined the cufflinks under a stronger lens, muttering to himself as he made notes on their craftsmanship and condition. These were presented as gifts not purchased individually, he concluded. Note the matching patina and identical wear patterns on the clasping mechanisms. They were likely commissioned as a set and distributed to members of the troupe, perhaps to commemorate a specific occasion. As evening fell, I had assembled a preliminary list of the Travelling Wonders Company members, cross-referenced with current theatrical engagements. Thomas Kenrick, I read from my notes, once billed as the strongman, now performs feats of strength at the Alhambra Theatre. He is the only other current London performer I can connect definitively to the troupe. Holmes nodded grimly. Then he may well be next. We must locate the remaining members of Henley's Wonders, particularly their manager, who would have knowledge of all the performers. The gravity of our task weighed heavily as the gaslights cast long shadows across the room. 2 men were dead, their faces frozen in macabre smiles, and we had little doubt that the killer's performance was far from over. The dancing figures seemed to mock our efforts, their crude forms containing a message we had yet to fully decipher, a message written in a language of vengeance whose final punctuation might well be measured in lives. Chapter 4. Ghosts of the Past. The following morning broke with a heavy rainfall that drummed against our windows at Baker Street. Holmes had been up since dawn, as evidenced by the fresh tobacco ash scattered about his chair and the numerous telegrams spread across the breakfast table. Mrs. Hudson brought in a pot of coffee, casting a disapproving glance at the disorder Holmes had created. "You've been busy, Holmes," I remarked, pouring myself a cup. "The hours before dawn are often the most productive, Watson," he replied, barely looking up from the theatrical directory he was studying. "I have dispatched inquiries to various sources regarding Henley's Travelling Wonders. It is essential we reconstruct the complete roster of that company and their movements 15 years ago. I examined the list I had compiled the previous evening. We have confirmed Holloway and Thornton, with Kenrick still performing. That leaves at least 8 other regular performers unaccounted for, according to these old playbills. Not to mention the supporting personnel, stagehands, costumers, ticket-takers," Holmes added. "A travelling show of that magnitude required considerable assistance. Any one of them might be our killer or our next victim." The arrival of a messenger boy interrupted our discussion. Holmes tore open the telegram with evident anticipation. "Excellent," he said, handing me the message. "Lestrade has located Mr. Henley. The former manager lives in retirement at Brixton. We shall call upon him directly." The rain had slackened to a drizzle by the time our hansom deposited us before a modest terrace house in Brixton. The small front garden was meticulously maintained despite the season, suggesting a resident who valued order and routine. Our knock was answered by a white-haired woman with a cautious expression. "Yes, gentlemen." "Mrs. Henley, I presume?" Holmes inquired politely. "I am Sherlock Holmes, and this is my colleague, Dr. Watson. Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard informed your husband of our visit." "Of course. Please come in." She ushered us into a small but tidy sitting room where a frail-looking man sat by the fire. Despite his evident age and the rheumatic stiffness with which he rose to greet us, Mr. Henley retained the commanding presence of one accustomed to directing others. "Mr. Holmes," he said, extending a trembling hand. "Margaret, some tea for our guests." His wife nodded and withdrew to the kitchen. "You've come about poor Holloway and Thornton," Henley stated, gesturing for us to be seated. "Dreadful business. I read about it in the papers." "Indeed," Holmes replied, studying the old man carefully. "We believe the murders may be connected to Henley's Travelling Wonders, which you managed some 15 years ago." A shadow seemed to pass over Henley's weathered face. "That was another lifetime, Mr. Holmes." Nevertheless, it appears that someone has carried a grudge from that time into the present, Holmes persisted. Both victims were members of your company, and both were wearing identical cufflinks featuring a jester's cap design. Henley's hand moved unconsciously to his own wrist, where I noticed with interest he wore a similar cufflink partially hidden by his sleeve. "Ah, you've observed my own," he said, noting Holmes's gaze. "Yes, I commissioned a dozen sets for the principal performers after our most successful season, a memento of our achievements." "And who received these tokens?" Holmes inquired. "The core company," Henley replied. "Holloway, of course, who was just beginning to develop his contortionist act, Thornton and his infernal dummy, Kenrick, our strongman, the Hughes sisters with their aerial display, Montgomery, our illusionist, Grimshaw, who designed our costumes and occasionally performed, and a few others whose names escape my aging memory." "We have reason to believe that Thomas Kenrick may be in danger," I interjected. "Do you maintain contact with any of your former troupe?" Henley shook his head. "The company disbanded after our final tour. Some continued in the profession, others found different paths." "The theatre is a transient world, Doctor." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Henley, was there any incident during your tours, any tragedy or conflict that might have inspired such calculated vengeance years later?" The old man's fingers tightened on the arms of his chair. "Nothing of significance," he answered, but the slight tremor in his voice betrayed him. "Come, sir," Holmes pressed gently. "2 men are dead, and others may follow. If you know anything that might illuminate this case, you must share it." Mrs. Henley returned with the tea tray, setting it down with a slight clatter. The tension in the room was palpable as she took her seat beside her husband, resting a supportive hand on his arm. "Tell them, James," she urged softly. "The past cannot be buried forever." Henley took a deep breath. "There was an incident in Dartmoor during our final tour. A terrible business." He paused, collecting himself. "We had performed for 3 nights in the village hall. The locals were mostly appreciative, but there were some rough elements, miners from the nearby quarry who had been drinking heavily. They heckled the performers, particularly the Hughes sisters. On the 3rd night, 3 of these troublemakers fell ill after the performance. They died before morning. The local doctor attributed it to heart failure, not unusual among men who worked such punishing jobs and drank to excess." "But you suspected otherwise," Holmes observed. Henley hesitated. "There were whispers, suspicions, nothing that could be proven, but the company was never the same afterward. There was an atmosphere of distrust, of secrets kept. We completed the tour and then disbanded." "Did the authorities investigate these deaths?" I asked. "A cursory inquiry only," Henley replied. "The villages of Dartmoor are isolated, Dr. Watson. Life is hard there, and death comes often enough not to raise undue alarm." Holmes had been listening intently, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "These dancing figures that were sent to Holloway before his murder, do they suggest anything to you?" "I cannot say," Henley answered, though his averted gaze suggested otherwise. "Mr. Henley," Holmes said with sudden sharpness, 2 men who wore your cufflinks have been murdered, their bodies arranged in theatrical tableaux, their faces painted with identical grotesque smiles. I do not believe in coincidence, particularly when it wears such elaborate costume. What are you not telling us?" The old man seemed to age further before our eyes, the weight of buried secrets bending his shoulders. "I have told you what I know, Mr. Holmes. If you wish to learn more, you must go to Dartmoor. Speak to those who remember. The village was called Grimpen." "Grimpen?" Holmes repeated thoughtfully. "The same name as your costume designer, Grimshaw, you mentioned." "A coincidence only," Henley replied, but his eyes did not meet Holmes's. "Now, gentlemen, I find I am quite tired. My health is not what it was." We took our leave shortly thereafter. Henley's reluctant revelations providing more questions than answers. As our hansom carried us back through the rain-slicked streets toward Baker Street, Holmes was unusually silent, lost in deep contemplation. "Do you believe him?" I asked eventually. "I believe he told us part of the truth, Watson, but not all. The connection to Dartmoor is significant, as is his evident discomfort when speaking of it. We must investigate these village deaths from 15 years ago." Holmes gazed out at the grey London landscape. The dancing figures are not merely threats, but a form of communication, perhaps even a confession. Our killer is telling a story, Watson, one that began in a Dartmoor village long ago and now plays out its final act on London's stages. The gravity of these reflections accompanied us back to our lodgings, where maps of Dartmoor and train timetables soon littered our sitting room. The ghostly dancers had led us to the shadows of the past, and it was there, Holmes was convinced, that we would find the hand that drew them. Chapter 5. The Village Tragedies. The journey to Dartmoor was undertaken the very next morning. A wintry sun cast long shadows across the platform at Paddington Station as Holmes and I boarded the early train, our compartment mercifully empty save for ourselves. My companion had spent much of the night consulting various reference materials on Dartmoor and the specific region surrounding the village of Grimpen, though he shared little of his findings with me. "Watson, I am increasingly convinced that the dancing figures represent specific performances from Henley's troupe," Holmes remarked, as our train pulled away from London. "Each figure appears to mimic a particular act. Contortion for Holloway, ventriloquism for Thornton. They are not merely threats, but a form of signature." "And the painted smile?" I inquired. "A mockery, perhaps. Or something more significant that we have yet to discern." Holmes tapped his fingers thoughtfully against the window. 3 villagers died after attending the performance in Grimpen 15 years ago. 3 deaths that coincide with the beginning of the end for Henley's travelling wonders. I suspect we shall find our answers there. The journey to Dartmoor was tedious, but ultimately brought us to the small station nearest Grimpen village by mid-afternoon. A weathered trap and driver were procured to convey us the remaining 5 miles across the wild, wind-swept moor. "Grimpen, you say?" the driver remarked, eyeing us doubtfully. "Not much there these days. Most folk moved on after the quarry closed. Strange place for gentlemen like yourselves to visit." "We are researching local histories," Holmes replied smoothly. "The region has many fascinating tales, I understand." "Aye, that it does," the driver nodded, flicking his whip to urge the horse forward. "Some best left untold." Grimpen revealed itself to be a cluster of grey stone buildings huddled against the elements, a place that time seemed to have forgotten. The village inn, the Tinner's Arms, offered basic but clean accommodation. The proprietor, a ruddy-faced man named Perkins, brightened considerably upon learning we intended to stay several days. "Not many visitors in winter," he explained, showing us to a pair of small rooms on the upper floor. "What brings you gentlemen to Grimpen?" "Historical research," Holmes answered. "Specifically, we are interested in a travelling theatrical company that performed here some 15 years ago." Perkins's expression shifted subtly. "Henley's troupe, you mean?" I remember them well enough. Brought a bit of excitement to the village, they did." "And tragedy as well, we understand," Holmes said carefully. 3 local men died after attending one of the performances. The innkeeper's demeanour cooled noticeably. "Old business, that. Best forgotten." "Nevertheless, we should like to learn more," Holmes persisted. "Are there those in the village who might recall the details?" "You might try the parish church," Perkins suggested reluctantly. "Reverend Forsyth has been here 30 years or more, keeps the parish records as well." He hesitated, then added, "And there's old Morris at the post office." He was a friend to the men who died. We thanked him for his assistance and, after refreshing ourselves, set out for the parish church of St. Michael's, a solid Norman structure that had weathered centuries of Dartmoor storms. The Reverend Forsyth proved to be a scholarly man in his 70s, initially cautious, but warming to Holmes's inquiries once assured of their serious nature. A sad business that, he sighed, unlocking the vestry where parish records were kept. 3 men dead in a single night, John Merrifield, Thomas Croker, and William Baskerville, all quarrymen, all in their prime. The doctor called it heart failure, but there was much speculation. What form did this speculation take? Holmes inquired, examining the death registry that the vicar had opened. Poison was whispered, though never proven. The men had been drinking heavily at the performance, and had been... He hesitated, somewhat disruptive. Heckling the performers, I suggested. More than that, I'm afraid. They made crude remarks to the female acrobats and attempted to interfere with one of the acts, the contortionist, I believe. They were ejected from the hall but lingered outside. There was some sort of confrontation afterward, though witnesses were scarce. Holmes copied the details from the registry into his notebook. And all 3 died the same night? Within hours of each other. Most unusual. Dr. Mortimer, he's since moved to Exeter, was quite perplexed by the symptoms which came on suddenly. Violent stomach pains, disorientation, respiratory difficulty, and then death. He attributed it to some form of heart seizure, perhaps exacerbated by their drinking. Were there local newspapers that might have reported on the incident? I asked. The Dartmoor Chronicle covered it. Forsyth nodded. I keep bound copies of local papers in the church archives. You're welcome to examine them. The following hours were spent poring over yellowed newspapers in the chilly vestry. The account of the deaths was minimal, but a separate article about Henley's travelling wonders provided valuable information, including a complete list of performers and a description of their acts. "Look at this, Watson," Holmes said, indicating an engraving accompanying the article, the full company photographed upon their arrival. I peered at the grainy image. There stood Holloway, recognizable despite his youth, and beside him Thornton with his ventriloquist's dummy. A powerfully built man who must have been Kenrick, posed with barbells. 2 identical young women in acrobat's attire, the Hughes sisters, presumably, stood to one side. A distinguished gentleman who matched Henley's description stood centre, and slightly apart from the others, a thin, intense-looking man with a portfolio under his arm. "Harold Grimshaw," Holmes murmured, noting my gaze. "The costume designer who shares his name with this village. Most interesting." From the church we proceeded to the post office where old Morris, a garrulous man despite his 80 years, was eager to share his recollections once certain his old friends were being remembered. "They weren't saints, mind you," he admitted. "Quarrymen work hard and play harder, but they didn't deserve what happened to them." "And what did happen, in your view?" Holmes asked. "Murdered, they were," Morris stated flatly. "I saw Tom not an hour before he took ill. Strong as an ox he was, then suddenly writhing in agony on his cottage floor. All 3 the same way, and all after having words with that theatrical lot." "What specifically transpired between them and the performers?" Holmes pressed. "They'd had too much ale, made fools of themselves at the show. The manager had them thrown out, but it was later, by the performers' wagons, that the real trouble came. John Merrifield told me about it before he took ill, said they'd gone to apologize to the acrobat girls, but some of the troupe took offense. There was pushing and shoving. The costume fellow, odd, intense man, got knocked down in the scuffle, cut his face badly on something, bleeding something terrible he was." "And afterward?" I inquired. "The troupe left the next morning earlier than planned, and my friends were dead. Make of that what you will, gentlemen." As we walked back to the inn through the gathering dusk, Holmes was unusually quiet, his brow furrowed in concentration. "You see the pattern forming, Watson," he finally said. "A confrontation, an injury to Grimshaw, followed by 3 deaths, and now, 15 years later, former members of Henley's troupe are dying, their faces painted in grotesque smiles. The dancing figures are not random, they mirror specific performances from that fateful tour." The wind moaned across the moor as darkness enveloped the ancient village, its secrets still half buried in the past. But Holmes had begun to unearth them, one macabre dancing figure at a time. In the small parish graveyard, 3 weathered headstones stood as silent witnesses to a tragedy whose final act was now playing out on London stages. Chapter 6. The Chemistry of Death. Our return journey to London was undertaken with a sense of urgency that had not accompanied our departure. Holmes had insisted on visiting the local churchyard before leaving Grimpen, where he had examined the graves of the 3 quarrymen with meticulous attention, even going so far as to make rubbings of the weathered inscriptions. Throughout the train journey he remained absorbed in his notes, speaking only occasionally to request clarification on some point of my medical knowledge. "The symptoms described by Reverend Forsyth and old Morris are consistent with several possible toxins," Holmes remarked as our train neared Paddington. "The rapid onset, the gastric distress, the respiratory difficulties, these suggest a powerful agent, administered perhaps in the men's final drinks that evening." "Could it have been some natural illness?" I suggested. Holmes shook his head decisively. 3 men, all taken ill within hours of each other, all having confronted the same theatrical troupe? No, Watson, this bears all the hallmarks of deliberate poisoning. And now, 15 years later, the survivors of that troupe are being eliminated one by one. Upon our arrival in London, we found several telegrams awaiting us at Baker Street. Inspector Lestrade had confirmed that the cause of death for both Holloway and Thornton was indeed poison, a complex compound that the police surgeon had been unable to identify precisely. A second message informed us that Thomas Kenrick, the strongman, had been placed under police protection at Holmes's request. "We must examine the theatrical makeup used on the victims," Holmes announced, already preparing a small case of chemical apparatus. Lestrade mentioned it was an unusual shade, not recognized by the other performers. "I suspect it may provide our most direct connection to the killer." A hansom conveyed us to Scotland Yard, where Lestrade greeted us with evident relief. "I was beginning to wonder if you'd abandoned the case for your Dartmoor explorations, Mr. Holmes," he remarked as he led us to his office. "On the contrary, Inspector," Holmes replied, "our investigations in Dartmoor have illuminated much of this case. The present murders are directly connected to events that transpired there 15 years ago." Lestrade raised his eyebrows skeptically, but produced a small glass container. "Here's a sample of the red grease paint used on both victims. The police surgeon has confirmed it contains no toxic elements. It was applied posthumously." Holmes examined the vivid red substance carefully, first visually and then transferring a small amount to a glass slide, which he studied under a portable magnifying lens he had brought. "Most interesting," he murmured. "The composition is unusual, not the standard theatrical grease paint. This has been specially formulated. I shall need to conduct more thorough tests at Baker Street." From Scotland Yard, Holmes directed our cab to Covent Garden, where the narrow streets housed numerous establishments catering to London's theatrical community. After inquiring at several shops, we were directed to Finnegan's Theatrical Supplies, a shabby but well-stocked establishment tucked away on a side street. The proprietor, a wizened man with ink-stained fingers, examined the small sample of grease paint Holmes had obtained from Lestrade. "Aye, this is special order, this is," he confirmed, peering at it through a jeweller's loupe. "Not my standard stock. I had to mix this particular shade for a customer about 6 weeks ago." "A customer who paid in advance and collected the order, after hours perhaps?" Holmes suggested. The man looked up in surprise. "How did you know that, sir?" Indeed, the gentleman was most particular. "Paid a premium for me to create this exact shade of red, arterial red, he called it. Left specific instructions about its composition." "And did you happen to see this customer?" I inquired. "Only briefly, kept his collar up and hat pulled low. Thin fellow, walked with a slight stiffness, like his joints pained him. Paid in cash, collected the order after closing one evening. I left it in a package by the back door as instructed." Holmes made a few notes in his pocketbook. "How many such packages did you prepare?" The shopkeeper thought for a moment. 3 containers, each the same size. Said he was working on a special theatrical production. "Special indeed," Holmes murmured. "Tell me, would you recognize this customer if you saw him again?" "Perhaps, sir, though I couldn't swear to it. The light was poor, and as I said, he kept himself well covered." We took our leave of the shop, Holmes seeming satisfied with the information gained. Back at Baker Street, he immediately set to work in his makeshift chemical laboratory, subjecting the grease paint sample to various tests. The acrid smell of his experiments soon filled our sitting room, causing me to retreat to the relative freshness of my bedroom for a time. It was nearly midnight when Holmes called me back to the sitting room, where he sat surrounded by test tubes, retorts, and chemical-stained papers. "I have isolated several distinctive compounds in this grease paint, Watson," he announced triumphantly. "Most notably, it contains a rare mineral pigment once used in fine art, but now largely abandoned due to its unstable nature. This particular formulation would require specialized knowledge, not merely theatrical experience, but a background in chemistry or perhaps art restoration." "Are you suggesting Grimshaw possesses such knowledge?" I asked. "I am suggesting, Watson, that our costume designer may have talents beyond mere theatrical dress. The company programs listed him as Harold Grimshaw, costumier, and scenic artist. The creation of theatrical backgrounds would require knowledge of pigments and their properties." Holmes held up a test tube containing a separated component of the grease paint. "This same knowledge could be applied to the formulation of poisons." "Then we must locate Grimshaw immediately," I said. "Indeed," Holmes agreed, "though I fear he has gone to considerable lengths to conceal his whereabouts. However, I have set the Baker Street irregulars to the task of searching records of property leases, particularly those in areas frequented by theatrical folk. Grimshaw would require privacy for his work, but proximity to his targets." A sharp knock at our door heralded the arrival of a grubby-faced urchin, one of Holmes's network of street informants. The boy handed Holmes a folded paper with evident pride. "Found it, Mr. Holmes, just like you said. Property records for H. Grimshaw in the area you specified." Holmes rewarded the lad with a coin and unfolded the paper eagerly. "Excellent work, Tommy. Watson, our quarry has a residence near the old theatre district, a small house set back from the street, leased 3 months ago to an H. Grimshaw, who paid 6 months' rent in advance." "Shall we inform Lestrade?" I suggested. "Not yet," Holmes replied. "First we must confirm our suspicions. We shall reconnoitre this property tomorrow morning. If it indeed houses our vengeful costume designer, we must approach with caution. He has already demonstrated his willingness to kill and his expertise in doing so undetected." As Holmes returned to his chemical analysis, I found myself contemplating the tragic sequence of events that had begun in a Dartmoor village 15 years before. A confrontation, an injury, 3 mysterious deaths, and now a calculated revenge executed with theatrical precision. The dancing figures seemed to spin through my thoughts, their crude forms no longer merely threatening but accusatory, stick-figure judges pronouncing sentence on those they deemed responsible for a long-ago injustice. Outside our windows, the fog-shrouded streets of London grew quiet as midnight passed. Somewhere in that darkness, a disfigured man plotted his next performance in a macabre production that had already claimed 2 lives. The red grease paint waited for its next application, the final curtain yet to fall on this tragedy of vengeance, long deferred. Chapter 7. The Man Behind the Mask. The house on Milner Street stood somewhat apart from its neighbours, shadowed by an ancient plane tree that obscured much of its facade from casual observation. Holmes and I approached it shortly after dawn, the early morning fog providing additional concealment for our reconnaissance. The dwelling appeared unremarkable, a narrow 3-story structure with shuttered windows and a small, unkempt garden surrounded by an iron railing. "Observe, Watson," Holmes whispered as we paused to cross the street. The lower windows have been recently fitted with new locks, and there are subtle marks on the doorframe suggesting additional bolts have been installed. Our quarry values his privacy and security. We circled the property carefully, noting a rear entrance that opened onto a narrow alley. No smoke rose from the chimneys, and no light showed behind the drawn curtains. "I believe the house is temporarily empty," Holmes concluded after our inspection. "Note the absence of recent footprints on the path despite last night's rain. Grimshaw has gone out perhaps to make preparations for his next performance." "Shall we wait for his return?" I asked. Holmes shook his head. "Time is of the essence, Watson. If my calculations are correct, he intends to strike again soon, possibly tonight. We must examine his workshop while the opportunity presents itself." With the practiced skill that never ceased to amaze me, Holmes deftly manipulated the lock of the rear door. Within moments, we had gained entry to a small, darkened kitchen. The interior of the house was cold and still, with the unmistakable chemical odour that I had come to associate with Holmes's own experiments, though here it was mixed with the sharp smell of turpentine and linseed oil. We moved carefully through the ground floor, finding little of interest until we reached what must have once been a parlour. This room had been transformed into a workshop, with a large table positioned beneath the window to catch the best light. Brushes, paints, and theatrical supplies were meticulously arranged alongside chemical apparatus that rivaled Holmes's own collection. "As I suspected," Holmes murmured, examining the workspace. "Grimshaw combines artistic talent with chemical expertise, a dangerous combination when directed toward revenge." The walls of the room were covered with theatrical sketches, costume designs showing extraordinary detail and artistry. But it was the material pinned to a large corkboard that drew our immediate attention. Newspaper clippings about Percy Holloway and Gilbert Thornton were arranged in neat rows, their performances and schedules carefully annotated in a precise hand. "Look here, Watson," Holmes said, indicating a calendar hanging beside the board. "The dates of the murders are circled in red, and here, tomorrow's date is similarly marked." I examined the calendar and noted with a chill that beside the circled date was written Kenrick, Alhambra, 8 p.m. "He plans to murder Thomas Kenrick tomorrow night at his performance," I said. "Indeed, and he has prepared thoroughly." Holmes indicated a stack of playbills from the Alhambra Theatre with Thomas Kenrick's strongman act prominently featured. A detailed floor plan of the theatre had been annotated with markings that suggested carefully planned routes of approach and escape. "This stands to be his most challenging target yet," Holmes observed. "Unlike Holloway and Thornton, Kenrick's physical strength would make a direct confrontation dangerous. Grimshaw must have devised a method of delivering his poison that does not require close contact." We continued our search of the house, moving upstairs to what appeared to be Grimshaw's living quarters. The bedroom was Spartan, containing little more than a narrow bed and a wardrobe. The latter, when opened, revealed several theatrical costumes and disguises, including the uniform of an Alhambra theatre stagehand. The most revealing discovery, however, awaited us in what had once been a second bedroom, but now served as Grimshaw's private study. Here, the walls were covered with images of an entirely different nature. Faded photographs of Henley's travelling wonders in their prime, group portraits, performance shots, and publicity materials were arranged in a display that might have seemed nostalgic were it not for the modifications made to them. The faces of Holloway, Thornton, and Kenrick had been circled in the same vivid red as the calendar dates, while several other performers, including Henley himself, were similarly marked but not yet crossed out. His list of targets extends beyond the 3 we identified, Holmes said grimly. Intends to eliminate every principal member of the troupe. A writing desk beneath the window held a journal bound in worn leather. Holmes opened it carefully, revealing page after page of meticulous entries dating back 15 years. The earlier entries detailed the daily activities of Henley's travelling wonders from the perspective of a dedicated company member, but the tone changed dramatically after an entry dated August 17, 1872, the night of the Grimpen performance. "Listen to this, Watson," Holmes said, reading from the journal. "The accident tonight has changed everything. My face, my future, sacrificed to protect their reputation. Henley convinced the others to claim I had abandoned the company, taking company funds with me. Betrayed by those I considered family, the quarrymen paid for their part with their lives, but the true debt remains unsettled. I shall wait, I shall plan, and when the time is right, justice will wear a smiling mask." "So it was revenge for his disfigurement and abandonment," I said. "A revenge 15 years in the making," Holmes agreed. The final pages detail his surveillance of the surviving troupe members over recent months. He has traced each of them, learned their routines, and planned each murder with theatrical precision. As we prepared to leave with our evidence, Holmes made one final discovery. A drawer containing a set of the distinctive jester's cap cufflinks identical to those worn by the victims. "He took these from his victims as trophies," Holmes said. "And here beneath them, another dancing figure drawing, but this one differs from those sent to Holloway." The crude stick figure depicted a man holding what appeared to be heavy weights, clearly representing Kenrick the strongman. It was the most detailed of the dancing figures we had seen, indicating a specific pose from the performer's act. "We must alert Lestrade immediately," I urged. "Kenrick's life depends on our stopping Grimshaw before tomorrow night's performance." Holmes nodded in agreement, carefully pocketing the journal and the latest dancing figure as evidence. We departed as carefully as we had entered, leaving no sign of our investigation that might alert Grimshaw should he return. As we hurried back through the fog-shrouded streets toward Baker Street, the enormity of what we had discovered weighed heavily upon us. A man so consumed by vengeance that he had dedicated 15 years to its perfect execution. The theatrical murders were his masterpiece, a performance designed to bring the final curtain down on those he held responsible for his ruination. The fog swirled around us like theatrical smoke, and somewhere within its concealing embrace moved Harold Grimshaw, a disfigured artist painting his revenge in the most permanent of colours. The stage was set for his final act, but Holmes was determined that this particular performance would never reach its intended conclusion. Chapter 8. The Final Curtain. The Alhambra Theatre stood resplendent against the night sky, its facade illuminated by the glow of electric lights that had recently replaced the traditional gas lamps. A steady stream of London's entertainment seekers flowed through its grand entrance, eager for the evening's diversions. Holmes, Lestrade, and I observed this scene from the vantage point of a darkened doorway across the street, our attention fixed on each figure that approached the theatre. "I have positioned men at every entrance," Lestrade informed us, his voice low. Plainclothes officers are stationed throughout the auditorium and backstage. If Grimshaw attempts to approach Kenrick, we shall have him." "Do not underestimate our quarry, Inspector," Holmes cautioned. "He has planned these murders with theatrical precision. I doubt he intends a direct approach, particularly given Kenrick's physical prowess." "What do you anticipate, Holmes?" I inquired. "Based on the evidence in his workshop, Grimshaw has prepared a disguise as a stagehand. This would grant him access to restricted areas of the theatre. The poison he employs acts rapidly, but requires ingestion. He must therefore contaminate something Kenrick will consume before or during his performance." As the appointed hour drew near, we entered the theatre separately to avoid drawing attention. Lestrade stationed himself near the main entrance, while Holmes and I made our way backstage under the pretext of being acquaintances of Thomas Kenrick. The backstage area was a labyrinth of narrow passages, prop storage and dressing rooms, alive with the controlled chaos that precedes any theatrical production. We located Kenrick in a small dressing room where a police constable in plain clothes stood guard. The strong man was an impressive figure, broad-shouldered and barrel-chested, with the powerful arms of one who has spent a lifetime cultivating physical strength. Despite being informed of the threat against his life, he projected an air of calm confidence. "Mr. Holmes," he greeted us with a firm handshake. "Inspector Lestrade has explained the situation. I confess I scarcely remember this Grimshaw fellow, though I recall the unfortunate business in Dartmoor." "Your memory may be imperfect, but his is not," Holmes replied. "He has harboured his grievance for 15 years, methodically planning his revenge against those he holds responsible for his disfigurement and abandonment." Kenrick nodded grimly. "I was young then, concerned only with my own career. When Henley suggested we distance ourselves from the scandal by claiming Grimshaw had absconded with company funds, I raised no objection." He sighed heavily. "A coward's choice that has returned to haunt us all." Holmes examined the dressing room carefully, paying particular attention to a carafe of water and a small basket containing fruit and a flask that Kenrick informed us contained his special tonic for maintaining his strength. "I have touched nothing since arriving," Kenrick assured us, "following your instructions precisely." "Excellent," Holmes replied. "Now we must modify your performance slightly if we are to draw Grimshaw into the open." The theatre was filled to capacity as the evening's entertainment commenced. Holmes and I positioned ourselves in the wings, affording a clear view of both the stage and the backstage area. Lestrade's men were strategically placed throughout, watchful for any sign of Grimshaw. As the performances proceeded, my eyes strained to examine every stagehand, every theatre employee who moved through the shadows beyond the footlights. "Patience, Watson," Holmes murmured, noting my restlessness. "Grimshaw will not move until Kenrick's act begins." The dancing figure drawing indicated a specific moment in the performance. When at last the master of ceremonies announced the modern Hercules, Kenrick strode onto the stage to enthusiastic applause. His act began with standard feats of strength, bending iron bars, lifting enormous weights, and supporting platforms upon which several volunteers from the audience were invited to stand. "Observe the stagehands carefully now," Holmes whispered. "According to the program, Kenrick's finale involves lifting a special apparatus delivered to the theatre only yesterday. Grimshaw would have had to prepare this equipment in advance." As if on cue, 2 stagehands wheeled out a complex arrangement of weights and pulleys. One man remained slightly apart from the others, his face partially obscured by the low cap of his uniform. Even at a distance I detected a certain stiffness in his movements that distinguished him from the practiced grace of the regular theatre employees. "There," Holmes breathed, "the one adjusting the central mechanism. Note the careful precision of his movements, a craftsman's hands, not a stagehand's." Holmes signalled to Lestrade, who began to make his way discreetly toward the stage. Meanwhile, Kenrick prepared for his finale, drinking deeply from his flask as we had instructed him, though we had replaced its contents with coloured water. The disguised Grimshaw watched this action with evident satisfaction, a subtle smile visible beneath the shadow of his cap. What happened next occurred with such rapidity that later accounts in the press varied considerably. As Kenrick approached the apparatus, Holmes stepped suddenly from the wings and called out, "The game is finished, Grimshaw. We have found your workshop and your journal. The police have surrounded the theatre." The disguised man froze momentarily, then, with surprising agility, seized a length of rope and swung himself upward into the complex network of catwalks above the stage. Holmes pursued immediately, with myself and several officers close behind. The audience, believing this to be part of the performance, applauded enthusiastically as the chase continued above their heads. Grimshaw moved with the desperation of a cornered animal climbing ever higher into the theatre's upper reaches. When we finally cornered him on a narrow platform near the great chandelier, the full tragedy of the man became apparent. The cap had fallen away, revealing a face terribly disfigured on one side by what must have been the injury sustained in Dartmoor 15 years before. "It was justice," he snarled, backing away as Holmes approached. "They left me for dead, blamed me for their own wrongdoing. I lost everything, my career, my face, my future." "And now you have lost your freedom as well," Holmes replied evenly. "The deaths of Holloway and Thornton cannot restore what you have lost." For a moment it seemed Grimshaw might surrender, but then his eyes gleamed with a final desperate resolve. "My performance is not yet complete," he hissed, and with theatrical timing he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small vial. "Grimshaw, no!" Holmes lunged forward, but he was too late. The costume designer raised the vial in a grotesque toast. "The final curtain," he declared. Before anyone could prevent it, he had consumed the contents. The effect was immediate and horrifying. Grimshaw's body convulsed violently as he staggered backward, his hands clutched at his throat, his face contorted in agony. Yet, even as the poison took hold, his lips twisted into a ghastly approximation of the same painted smile he had left on his victims. With a final, lurching movement, he toppled over the railing. There was a moment of suspended horror as he fell through the air, arms outstretched like a performer taking a final bow before landing with devastating impact upon the stage below. The audience's applause transformed into screams of shock and horror as the reality of what they had witnessed became apparent. In the sombre aftermath, as police cleared the theatre and medical men confirmed what we already knew, Holmes stood contemplatively by the body of Harold Grimshaw. The man's face, even in death, seemed divided, half bearing the scars of old injuries, half frozen in that terrible smile. "A tragedy in 3 acts," Holmes observed quietly. "Begun in Dartmoor with a moment of cruelty, developed through years of bitter planning, and concluded tonight with a final desperate performance." "He was a murderer, Holmes," I reminded him. "Yes, and justice demanded his apprehension, but I cannot help but reflect on how different matters might have been had his companions shown him compassion rather than abandonment in his hour of need. The true tragedy, Watson, is that vengeance consumed whatever artistic genius Grimshaw once possessed." As we departed the Alhambra that night, the dancing figures seemed to hover in my mind's eye, crude symbols of a performance that had begun 15 years earlier and ended in blood upon the stage. The dancers were stilled at last, their macabre choreography complete. Yet the moral of their dance would remain with us long after the final curtain had fallen on the case I would later chronicle as the Dancing Death. Thank you for joining me on Café Stories for the dancing death. If you enjoyed Holmes's theatrical investigation, please hit the like button and subscribe for more classic detective tales. Until next time, God bless you.